Hey everybody, this is Tim back again with another video, and in today's video I wanted to talk a little bit about hardware and like what type of hardware should you buy if you're building a workstation for visual effects, 3D, editing, like anything of that nature. And the difference here being is that I don't want to mention specific hardware types. Like I don't want to mention specific CPU, like you should buy this CPU, you should buy this RAM, this graphics cards, because like, if I do that, then this video will be completely obsolete like 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now. What I want to do instead is sort of focus this more around the why you would want to, for example, buy a multi-core CPU with lower clock speeds versus a like a CPU with like less cores and like higher clock speeds, or vice versa. Because like there's a difference when you would buy one over the other, and there's no specific like this is the best or this is the best. Same is for graphics cards, same for memory, for drives, all of that kind of stuff. So what I'm hoping to do with this video is to somewhat explain like which types of hardware will be good in which scenario. Of course, your results may vary. Like I come at this as a sort of generalist-ish who is like mostly focused on effects. So I mainly work in Houdini. If you're watching this and you don't work in Houdini, that's completely fine. I've worked in other software before, and I have quite a broad sort of knowledge, I think, about just the general VFX pipeline and what hardware works well for every scenario. But of course, there's also things that I don't personally deal with a lot. But I think in general, I should be able to give you a pretty good overview. So there's also not going to be any fancy graphics overlay on this. This would just be a monologue, so feel free to just put this in the background while you continue working. This is going to be a sort of a monologue. I know that I kind of generally, that's the way I also listen to videos mostly. I just have my phone in my pocket with my headphone on and I just listen to stuff. So this is going to be one of those where you don't have to watch the video. You can just listen to the video. It will just be me talking and no fancy overlays. So you're not missing anything if you're just listening to this. So just pointing it out there. So let's talk a little bit about CPUs. So yeah, I mean, you can get a CPU with very few cores. You can get CPU with a lot of cores. And the past few years, like since AMD started getting competitive again back in 2017, there has been an increase in core count, which is great for VFX. And your initial thought might be, all right, more cores is more better. Which is not always the case. In general, having a lot of cores is very beneficial to doing visual effects work. But for example, when I built my own current workstation, which I have a build log for, by the way, link in the description, I didn't buy the beefiest Threadripper because I have a 3970X, which is the 32-core Threadripper, and there's also a 64-core Threadripper. And I could have bought that one because I wanted to buy the best workstation that I could possibly build. However, in my scenario, the 32-core would be better. So let me explain a little bit about why less cores might be better in some scenarios. And for some people, even going lower might be better. Like I think for a lot of people, having the 3970X might not be the best CPU. You could probably, you would probably have a better deal if you buy the 5950X, for example. So the reason being is that not everything in all VFX programs is multi-threaded. Not even in Houdini. Like in Houdini, heavy simulations, like if you do a flip simulation, a pyro simulation, once you go pretty heavy, that is pretty well multi-threaded. So what I mean by multi-threaded is that it utilizes all of your cores on your CPU. And the problem with multi-threading is that it's notoriously difficult to multi-thread some things. So, like as an example, if I have a particles moving around, that particle relies on the information of the previous frame. So you cannot just like say, okay, I simulate this particle on this core, this particle on this core, this particle on this core, because they need to be aware of the previous of the previous time step. They need to be aware of each other. So it's not as easy as just being able to parallelize everything. You cannot parallelize everything. Some things can be pretty well parallelized. Like if you deal with very high resolution simulations, in that case, it can be beneficial. And generally, the heavier the sim get, the more benefit you get from more cores. But if you kind of like, if you build a system, let's say in Houdini, for example, or in Blender, or wherever you work in, and let's say you have dozens of nodes, and there's one node in there that doesn't support multi-threading, your entire node tree will completely slow down. So this is where single core speed is quite important, because if you have higher single core speed, even if you have that one node that doesn't support multi-threading, and of course it's always best to just build your setups that they can multi-thread, but if you have that node and you have a CPU that has, for example, a 20% or 30% higher single clock speed, your like cooking your node tree would be 20 to 30% faster, because everything bottlenecks in that one node. So this is why, for example, like just a simple pop simulation is not necessarily always faster on a very multi-core CPU. Like that might be just as fast or even faster on a 8-core or 16-core just high clock speed CPU. So it really depends on what you're doing. Also, if you're building a very multi-core driven build, you kind of also need a lot of RAM, because like every core wants its own sort of RAM to work with. And if you're gonna like build a 32 or 64 core monster, like I did, for example, it doesn't make sense to only put 32 gigabytes of RAM, because if you have 32 core CPU and 32 gigs of RAM, each core would only have, well, I mean, like 1 gigabyte. For even if you take multi-threading into consideration, and each core would have 512 megabytes of RAM. So that's not really a lot. So that's something to sort of consider. So you need to kind of consider your workload. If you are for example, just if you do, let's say you're a Cinema 4D artist. Cinema 4D, a lot of stuff, these days it's better, but in Cinema 4D, a lot of stuff used to be very single-threaded. MoGraph used to be mostly single-threaded. They have improved it. I haven't used Cinema that much in a couple of years, so I can't speak specifically for how it is now. But like a lot of the tools there were single-threaded tools. So if you were to like put in a super machine, like if you had like a dual Xeon with like a ton of CPU cores, that would give you absolutely no benefit. Like it would be just for general doing animation and doing MoGraph stuff, it would be better to have a lower core CPU, because it would be like higher clocked, it would be faster. Where multi-core then again comes in is if you're going to do CPU rendering. So if you're going to render with, for example, cycles in CPU mode on Blender, if you're going to render in Mantra, if you're going to render in Arnold, if you're going to render in RenderMan, stuff like that. That's where that scales basically perfectly, because when you're going to render, essentially each core gets its own bucket and it's going to render with its own bucket. Again, this is also where RAM comes in a little bit, because if it gets its own sort of bucket, might be good that it has enough RAM also to sort of be able to fully utilize to be able to utilize the core. So it's kind of a fine balance between these two. You kind of need to just think of your workload. If you're doing a lot of After Effects, for example, After Effects also performs generally better on machines with somewhat higher clock speeds. So if you're a motion designer doing a lot of After Effects, slightly higher clock speeds is probably the better way to go. So you kind of need to balance that. Again, if you're doing effects, they're like I do, pretty balanced. Like that's why the 3970X for me is a good balance, because I render mostly on my graphics card and I simulate, of course, on my CPU, also some stuff on GPU, because Axiom Solver is absolutely awesome. And also the OpenCL stuff in Houdini is also getting better. But yeah, that's essentially kind of what you need to sort of pay attention to. So just like look up your workload and just like check for if it's heavy on the single core, if it's heavy on the multi-core, if it can be multi-threaded. That's essentially what you need to pay attention to. So it kind of also applies to compositing. I personally don't use Nuke. For example, I use Fusion. It's the same with After Effects as well. For example, final renders, you can generally multi-thread. After Effects doesn't necessarily like the multi-threading, because you can just, but like even if you use After Effects, if you just submit your After Effects project to deadline, you can just render multiple frames at the same time as long as you have enough RAM. But it's again where we get to the RAM thing. But if you just play through it, for example, After Effects, like just does the whole thing linearly. I think they just they have a beta build now where they are bringing back the multi-core rendering. I think Nuke does the multi-core thing a lot better, but I could be wrong. And I think Nuke also has pretty good acceleration for graphics card, but we'll get to that when we get to the graphics card stuff. If you're doing sculpting, modeling, probably single core is going to be probably better, because like stuff like that doesn't necessarily multi-thread the best. So again, for your own workload, just I guess Google whatever I am doing single core, whatever I'm doing multi-thread, and try to find a balance between the two. One more thing about CPUs, like if you want to compare CPUs, again, like it's pretty good to just look up benchmarks. I kind of like, I used to kind of like Cinebench for comparing CPUs. It's a rendering benchmark. The thing I don't like is that nowadays they kind of do a lot of releases with Cinebench, which makes it difficult to compare, because they used to have like one version of Cinebench every couple of years, and then you could easily compare Cinebench scores between generations of CPUs. Oh, by the way, for CPUs, higher clock speed, like if you have a CPU that's like 4 gigahertz of one generation, it doesn't mean that the 4 gigahertz is the same in that generation as it is in the previous generation, because there's also something called IPC, which is instructions per clock. And so that's essentially how many instructions can the CPU do for each clock cycle. And like one CPU might be able to, let's say, 100 instructions for one clock cycle, and another CPU might be able to do, let's say, 110 instructions for one clock cycle. So even if, like, let's say you have one GPU that's one CPU that's 4 gigahertz and another that's 4 gigahertz, if one has 110 instructions per clock, that one will be faster for single clock performance. And again, the single clock performance can be important in some scenarios. Anyway, if you want to compare things, look at benchmarks. Like you have Corona benchmark. It's also CPU benchmark. Look at various just benchmark for rendering, because I think that's pretty good sort of type of benchmark that you can look at if you want to compare CPUs. Like look at Cinebench, look at Corona render benchmark, stuff like that, and then you can go from there, see what your budget is, see what's the best sort of price to performance for your budget, and then pick one from there. So I kind of already talked a little bit about RAM, and it kind of always used to be the case where RAM speed didn't really matter. Back when Intel was still dominating, RAM speed didn't necessarily matter too much. Like you would get a little bit more bandwidth on your memory if you had faster memory, but the performance difference was very minimal. Like I had an old system where and you should never do that, but I had mixed and matched RAM, which you shouldn't do. I was surprised that it was stable. So I was running it single channel, and there was like little to no performance difference, or if I was using quad channel on it. So it, like back in that day, it didn't really make a big difference. However, nowadays with AMD, AMD has Infinity Fabric. So how AMD chips, and this is essentially how AMD was able to sort of grow rapidly and like really increase the core count, is what they're doing with their CPUs with Infinity Fabric is essentially they have chiplets. So chiplets are essentially sort of a CPU inside of a CPU. So they have, their CPU is made up of multiple dies. So they're like small dies, and those have an interconnect. So let's say you have maybe one chiplet that I don't remember exactly how many cores were in the chiplet. I think it was 4. I could be wrong. Like don't like let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. I think they added a new one also in the new, like they added extra ones in the new chips, but don't pin me down on the amount of chiplets. It's just mostly just about the theory. Anyway, what they have is they have the chiplets on the chip. There's an interconnect between the chiplets. So let's say you have 4 cores here, 4 cores here, 4 cores here, 4 cores here. So 4, 8, 12, 16 will be 16 cores total. In order to communicate they have Infinity Fabric, which is essentially the interconnect between those things. And the Infinity Fabric is linked to the speed, so to the bandwidth of your memory. So this is why fast memory is very important if you're doing an AMD build. Because if you have faster memory, your Infinity Fabric can run at a higher speed, which means your CPU will also be faster. So for Intel builds, unless they do something completely different with their new architecture that they're going to come out, unless they completely revise that, they haven't done anything like that yet. So RAM speed is less important on the Intel side. Again, if you're watching this in 2 years, might be completely different. But at the moment, RAM speed, having fast RAM is very important on AMD. So don't go and buy very low RAM. For AMD, it's like it's like it really pays off to get faster RAM. It's why I got I have 256 gigabytes, not megabytes. I'm old. I have 256 gigabytes of RAM in my system, and I have it at 3600. And I really wanted to get the 3600 kit because of the Threadripper and the interconnects. And it's been pretty stable at the 3600, which I'm pretty happy with, because I was able to utilize the speed of my CPU. I tried underclocking it, running some benchmarks as well with slightly lower clocks. There was a slight performance dip. It wasn't that big. I haven't tried severely underclocking it, see what that would do. Technically, it would degrade the performance a little bit more. I guess I should test that, but I haven't tested that yet. But anyway, now that you understand the theory, you probably understand why you should get faster RAM for your AMD build. Another thing that's important to discuss when we're talking about memory is, of course, the memory capacity. And we already talked a little bit about that. If you have more cores, probably a good idea to get, bigger capacity RAM. And the amount of RAM that you need, again, really depends on your use case. If you're just doing simple, again, I'm just trying to just include this for everybody from beginner to high end. But if you're doing just mostly doing modeling, just some simple modeling, texturing some stuff, you can probably, on the very low end, you could get away with 16, but that's probably not the best idea. I would say the minimum you should probably get for Workstation, if you're on a budget, is in this 2021 times, is probably 32 gigabytes of RAM. RAM is pretty cheap. And for just general sort of modeling, texturing, system, something like that, 32 is probably just the base level that you should get. 16 will probably be fine, but you might run into other issues once you maybe want to do something more. But as just general modeling, editing, not After Effects and compositing editing, that's more with just general editing, then you will probably be fine with something on the lower end. Once you start getting into compositing is pretty RAM heavy, especially After Effects. After Effects absolutely terrible. I have 256 gigabytes of RAM, and After Effects is so terribly optimized that I've seen it peak over 128 or when using. I don't use it that much anymore, but it's not pretty. And because when you're compositing, it's gonna load all of these sort of passes. That's also why you generally want to sort of render proxies for everything that you do. So it doesn't need to load everything at once, because everything that it does, it needs to contain that in RAM, and that will, just really increase your RAM usage. So if you're gonna do a lot of compositing, I'd say 64 minimum, probably 128 is gonna be good. Get more if you can get more, but 64, I guess, as a minimum. When you're going to do a simulation type build, so if you're going to do effects, I'd say also 64 at a minimum. Simulation is notoriously heavy on RAM, because if you have, let's say you're doing a water simulation, power simulation, it needs to contain all of the voxels that it's currently working on within memory in order to work on them. If you've ever done a pyro sim or flip simulation, you know that it's a lot of data. Even your cache files might be well over a gigabyte a frame if you're doing heavy sims. So this is really try to sort of keep 64 as a minimum, but 128 will be really amazing to have. And if you can afford it, 256 will be very nice, because that's what I also have noticed with my workstation. I can just have stuff cached in the background and do stuff in the background, and I still have RAM and CPU resources to spare to just keep working. If you're running a heavy sim in the background and it's gonna, let's say it's gonna eat up like 90 gigabytes of RAM or whatever, 80 gigabytes of RAM, and you only have 128, might be difficult to still do other stuff. While if you have a lot, you can still keep like stuff going on. And like I mentioned, I have I generally have my deadline render manager and just doing tasks in the background constantly. And if you have a lot of RAM, that's just really nice to be able to have that kind of RAM. And also, if you're doing Houdini, Tops will just completely utilize everything that it can utilize. So that's also just really nice, I guess, to have a lot of RAM there. So when you're doing all the stuff like sculpting, modeling, it kind of depends. I know ZBrush is pretty RAM heavy, so if you have more RAM, it's gonna be pretty nice to have more RAM, because you can work on higher resolution sculpts in there. I guess that's also VRAM. I'm not sure on ZBrush, because I don't personally use ZBrush. I'm not sure how heavy it is on VRAM, but I can imagine that VRAM will also come into play there. VRAM is the RAM on your graphics card, by the way. We'll get to that in the graphics card part of this video. But anyway, if you have like a lot of RAM, you will just be able to fit bigger data sets. So don't skim on the RAM. So another thing that you might want to pay attention to when you're building a workstation is you have this thing called ECC RAM, which stands for error correcting code. And on current consumer hardware, it's generally not used that much. So what error correcting code is essentially is normally when you have a memory module, it has like 8 data modules on it. ECC memory has a 9th module, and that thing essentially can correct for bit flip. So if the memory detects an error, it can correct the error, which means a little bit a more stable system. It means like you have less corruption in your file, in your files, etc., etc. I have to say, like for most people, like ECC is in most uses not necessarily too useful. Like if I had to choose between for an AMD build for fast RAM or ECC, because you can use both, to be honest, on AMD, I would probably go for the fast memory, which is what I did. But so and with like ECC on a work, I know a lot of like professional build workstations. If you buy them from Dell, whatever, they all have ECC, just because if you're buying a work, like those machines often also get sold to big studios. If you have, let's say you have a big studio with 500 people working there, and you have, let's say, a machine that runs into some issue once every month. If you're just by yourself, that's not too big of a deal. Like, let's say it has a blue screen like once every 2 months or once every month. Like, it will probably look like I've run machines for 24/7 for a long time, and like by one of my machines there, like just runs 24/7 and like no issues, no ECC RAM. It never crashes. Same with my workstation. I have the very occasional crash on my main workstation, but in general, there's no problems. But if you scale that up to like a very big studio with a lot of people with a lot of computers, the occasional crash is, of course, then the IT department needs to be called. They need to come in, check if everything's wrong, blah, 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 blah. In that case, also, if an error there would corrupt something on the file server, that might be problematic. And of course, the IT department also needs to get paid. So in that case, it might make sense for them to just like have those workstations have ECC, because in a bigger studio, it kind of makes sense because of the scope. That's also why, for example, Quadro cards, which also have ACC, you're kind of crazy if you're going to buy that for home use, because you're not getting anything from it. A little bit lower energy use, a little bit more stability, I guess. But for a very big, like if you have studio with like 1,000 people, or that's probably overkill, but like hundreds of people, and like there's like like hundreds of render machines, etc., etc. In that case, something like Quadro or ECC makes sense. So anyway, that's why that exists. I have one machine that has ECC memory. That's my home built Truenas server, which is for my bulk storage. That one uses ECC. If you want to know more about the ins and outs for that, I have a build video for that one. Essentially, that's my bulk storage. That thing has ECC because it corrects for bit flips. So if it protects against corruption, and you don't want to. So in that case, it makes sense. So that's why I got ECC there. If you're watching this video, I guess in 2022 or above, by now, probably when you're watching this, DDR5 is out. DDR5, there's no difference anymore between ECC, non-ECC. DDR5 by itself has ECC. So it's just in the specification. So every module will have ECC, which is pretty good. Like, I'm happy that they sort of finally have just integrated it as a general thing for everyone. And I guess that's the reason why they also did this, because the capacities keep getting higher and higher and higher with RAM. And the thing is, once capacities get higher, the possibility of a bit flip or like an error get higher and higher and higher as well. So you I guess that's why they built it into specification. Anyway, I kind of hope that this makes sense, like when you should buy how much RAM. So on the lower end, I'd say like even if you're doing a budget build for VFX, try to get 32 if you can, because it will really help out. Like even if you're not interested in doing simulations, as of now you're only modeling or you're not doing any compositing stuff. Let's say you might want to try it at some point. Of course, you can still upgrade your RAM. That's one thing that you also need to pay attention to, I guess, with RAM. It's better to buy RAM as a full kit, because then it's you can know that it always works. If you buy a kit, even if because you don't want to mix and match RAM. So if you buy, let's say, 32 gigs of RAM right now, of like with a specific type number, if you next time buy it, try to buy the same type number, but still it's not guaranteed to work. There have been issues where like instances where even the same kit might not work together. So that's why, for example, when I decided to go for 256 gigs on my system, I bought it as one kit instead of getting 128 and then maybe later wanting to upgrade, because I just wanted to make sure that it would work off the get-go. So kind of hope that makes sense. Also, when buying RAM, important thing is to always check the qualified vendor list, especially on AMD. This is important. Intel gets away with a little bit more, but if you have if you're going to buy a motherboard, go to the website of the manufacturer and check the qualified vendor list there. There should be a qualified vendor list of the types of RAM that are supported on the motherboard. You can also check the qualified vendor list on your RAM and see which motherboards are supported. For example, my RAM is not on the qualified vendor list of my motherboard, because my motherboard came out before my RAM came out, so it wasn't verified for each other. But my specific kit was made for this motherboard, so it only supports like four motherboards. And that means that it has an XMP profile for this motherboard. So if you know XMP, I forgot what it's extreme memory profile, I think is correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially what they do is they test the memory to work at a specific frequency, specific timings, etc., and they baked it into a profile. And then if your motherboard is supported, then you can enable the XMP profile, and then it will all work. So yeah, that's where the sort of that's where you have where you have the XMP profile. So make sure that you sort of have this that you check the qualified vendor list of your motherboard and of your memory. Make sure they match up, especially on AMD. This can be a real pain in the butt, because AMD it's gotten better with the 3000 and 5000 series, but they are very picky with RAM, to the point where a lot of people just couldn't get specific, like a lot of RAM not to work on their motherboard. So keep that in mind whenever you're buying RAM. Right, I guess that's enough about RAM. I guess maybe I can come up with anything and we'll just throw it in later. But I think I've given you sort of a good idea about like what you should buy. So let's just dive maybe into graphics cards. So with graphics cards, I guess it's a little bit more straightforward, but it's just there's less to pay attention to. Essentially, it's a balance between how much VRAM do you want and do you need and the speed of your card. So if you are talking about about NVIDIA, generally for VFX stuff, I wouldn't buy AMD. And that's not because I don't like AMD, because I really like AMD. But the thing is, there's like NVIDIA has CUDA, which is sort of their software development kit, which only runs on NVIDIA cards. And I guess technically they could make it work for AMD, but they don't do that. Anyway, there's a lot of programs in the visual effects industry that use CUDA to do graphics acceleration. So even if you don't use software that uses CUDA right now, because for example in Houdini everything is just like the graphics stuff is with OpenCL, it probably still makes sense to buy an NVIDIA card, because let's say you want to get into GPU rendering at some point. Like for example, I use Redshift quite a lot, as you know, that uses CUDA. Octane uses CUDA. Other stuff like, for example, Arnold, I think, and RenderMan, they have their GPU version, and that I think just uses can also use AMD. So I don't think there's a problem there. I think Blender, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a Blender user. I think Cycles can use CUDA mode or OpenCL mode, and what I read, I think, is that CUDA mode is faster. But again, I could be wrong on this because I don't use it personally. I'm just like, this is what I read. So it probably makes sense to get for VFX, get an NVIDIA GPU, no matter how much I would want to recommend AMD GPUs. Unfortunately, it's not the case, and I hope at some point AMD will be more viable for VFX workloads, but at the moment, they're just not. So get an NVIDIA GPU unless you're absolutely 100% sure that you're not going to use it for anything CUDA, which might be a unique use case that you're doing where you're not using it. Anyway, so outside of all of that, there's kind of the thing where you have like your CUDA cores, which is the way just NVIDIA calls their cores. So amount of cores, speed of your cores, and the amount of VRAM. Essentially, you have your amount of cores, and the thing with I was talking about the multi-threading thing before with CPUs, which essentially is that like your CPU cores, like each core handles like a different part of the workload. The reason why, for example, GPU rendering or just doing stuff on GPU in general is a lot faster is because those are tasks that are perfectly multi-threaded. And GPUs have a lot of cores, where a CPU might have 16 cores, 32 cores. A GPU might have a couple thousand cores. So it's a lot more cores. So they're more like dumb cores, so they are not multi-purpose. Like a CPU core is like very multi-purpose, can do a lot of different things. While a GPU core can, doesn't know a lot of things. It can do limited instructions, but it can do them. It can, like, if you can multi-thread something and run it on your graphics card, it's going to be really fast. So it's kind of a balance between these two. I generally, you can look at a whole bunch of benchmarks for whatever is useful. I kind of like the benchmark Octane Bench, even though I don't use Octane myself. I think Octane Bench is a pretty good benchmark for just looking at the sort of the speed of your graphics card. And you can go for, so if you just Google for Octane Bench, you can find them. You can find different graphics cards and what our Octane Bench score is. There's also some render farms like Grid Market, for example, who index their own graphics card and pricing in Octane Bench scores. So you can sort of compare your own card to whatever it is they have, and you can sort of calculate how much your renders are going to cost. So more Octane Bench points, better. That's essentially what it is. So from there, you can sort of do a price to performance ratio. Like, okay, I am getting this much Octane Bench for my $1. And is that worth it? So that's just something to consider. Once you get to the higher end, currently we have 3080s, 3090s. Of course, the price for performance will, you will pay more for marginal upgrades. But just you can do you can do your own calculation and see what works for you. So another important thing here is the VRAM. And VRAM is the RAM on your graphics card. So where your your system has RAM, your graphics card also has RAM. And if you're gonna do stuff on your GPU, it needs to, you need to it needs to fit in the VRAM. If it doesn't fit in the VRAM, it needs to swap stuff from memory, which is slow. For example, Redshift and Octane also does to some extent. I'm not sure if it's completely implemented yet, but anyway, Redshift which is a render engine if you don't know it, but Redshift is a GPU renderer where the essentially Redshift can go out of core. So let's say you have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, for example, and your scene, for example, is 11 gigs. So if it's rendering, you can check your you can download GPU-Z, for example, and then check how much RAM is in use on your card. And let's say you have a 12 gigabyte GPU and it's using 10 gigabytes. Everything is going to be really fast. But what if you add some extra stuff in your scene, like a couple high-res models, some textures, whatever, and it gets above the 12 gigabyte? Some render engines will completely crash and it will not work, and you need to default to CPU mode. I think Cycles is like that. I'm not sure. Like, again, don't pin me down on any of the stuff I say about Blender because I don't use it. Anyway, but once it goes out of core, like in terms of Redshift, what it's going to need to do is going to need to grab stuff from disk or from RAM, swap out the stuff that's already in the VRAM in order to render it. And that really slows it down like a lot, like quite a lot. Like I now have two 3090s in my main machine and one in my render machine. But in the render machine before, I had two 1080 Ti's and one 1080. And this personal project that I'm now working on, I had some scenes that were rendering like the 3090. Like I had one 3090 before, and that was around 20 to 30% faster when it was just rendering than the 1080 Ti's and the 1080 in another machine. And I had this one scene which would go out of core on the other machine because my 3090s have 24 gigabytes of VRAM. The other ones have the 1080 has 8 and the 1080 Ti's have 11. And that scene was going out of core, and the render time went from like 12 minutes a frame to something like 40 minutes a frame. So you really can see like it's a very big difference. Once you go out of core, you never go back. No, I'm just kidding. But again, like going, you want to avoid going out of core. So if you have more VRAM, you can get away with a lot more. You can do bigger scenes, and it's really just very useful to be able to have something like that. If you're talking about the higher end, like 3090s at the moment is one of the higher end GPUs, or if you're talking about any Quadro card, well, not any Quadro card, but the higher end Quadro cards, they also have something called an NVLink bridge. I actually bought an NVLink bridge. I have a box here. I haven't tested it out extensively yet, but this was the box for the NVLink bridge. Right. Anyway, what an NVLink bridge is, it allows you to link up two cards together, and it allows you to pool VRAM together. So let's say you have two 3090s, which have 24 gigabytes each. Allows you to pull them together and can use 48 gigabytes of RAM. This depends on the implementation, so don't go and think that you have 48 gigabytes of RAM and you can use it everywhere, because it depends on the implementation and not everything is supported. Redshift supports it. I haven't extensively tested it. I had the feeling that the scene was like I had some scene where I thought it was a little bit faster, but like realistically, it's already difficult to push like some of the 24 gigabyte stuff. But this should be pretty nice, and also maybe in the future, I'm kind of hoping that maybe Houdini OpenCL stuff will also get NVLink support at some point, or Axiom will hopefully also get NVLink support at some point. Maybe with Axiom 2.0, we'll see. But anyway, so that allows you to sort of pool it together. So that might be something to consider. But this is only available on like the very high-end graphics cards. So unless you have two 3090s right now, or any like 2080 Ti's also had it, but realistically, like the 3090s now are really hard to get. So I think like for most people, probably if you're watching this, you probably won't need this, but because you probably already know quite a lot about graphics card in general. Anyway, So that's essentially kind of the balance between CPU, GPU, VRAM. About workloads with VRAM, like I mentioned, OpenCL. Compositing gets accelerated by OpenCL to some extent. I think Nuke is pretty good with CUDA or OpenCL. I don't know which one it is. Like let me know if it's CUDA or if it uses OpenCL. I don't use Nuke. So some compositing apps are quite optimized. After Effects and stuff have decent CUDA acceleration. Premiere has some CUDA acceleration. So there's workflows where you really like if you have if you're gonna edit like 8K material or something, then a lot of VRAM will be beneficial. So those are kind of the workflows, I guess, that you need to think about. If you're gonna do texture painting in Mari or Substance, if you're gonna work with a lot of gonna work with a lot of texture sets on like many different UDIMs, like if you have a whole bunch of 8K UDIMs or whatever, that's gonna eat up a lot of VRAM. So if you're gonna do any of that, I think even NVIDIA, when they released the 3090, they gave that as an example in Substance Painter. So if you're gonna do a lot of like texture painting, stuff like that, the VRAM is gonna be quite nice to have. So in that case, probably makes sense to get something like 3090. And I'd say like 3090 is a pretty good workstation card right now. I'd say like what they're doing with like just your regular 3080 or 3080 Ti's, I think 10 gigabytes on a regular 3080 is just, in my opinion, is a little bit on the low end, especially for 2021. Probably if you're watching this like later, that's just on the low end. And I personally think it's too low, but if it's within your budget, if you're on the lower budget, by the way, at the moment, 3060 Ti has 12 gigabytes of RAM. It's not the fastest card, but that might make sense if you really want, like if you're on the lower end and you just want, like, for example, a card for, like a couple of cards for GPU rendering, like let's say 2 cards for GPU rendering. Something like that might be pretty interesting. But again, like NVIDIA has a really weird scheme now for their graphics card. I'm not sure what they have been doing. Anyway, this is kind of my take on graphics cards. I kind of hope that it sort of makes sense. But maybe one more thing with the graphics cards. If you're doing real-time production, of course, more VRAM is going to be very important because that probably cannot go. Well, you can swap out assets, but stuff like that will need to go in VRAM. I think your Unreal Engine can also do the NVLink thing. Don't pin me down on that. I think they do the NVLink thing as well. I've started to sort of try to learn Unreal because it's so cool what you can do with it nowadays. Anyway, that was the graphics card. Let's talk about something else. So let's talk a little bit about motherboards, and it's probably the least sexy part of the video. But a motherboard, you might overlook it, but it's going to be very important because a motherboard is the heart of your build. It's where all the components go in, and this is a little bit harder to quantify for every specific scenario, but there's a couple of things that are, for example, interesting to keep in mind. One important thing is, of course, is your CPU compatible? It's, of course, the first thing. Like, check which CPU you want and then go and look for the socket for that CPU that you want, and then look in, because like motherboards have like sockets which like CPUs can fit into, and you need to match the socket to the CPU. So that's something you need to do. Once you've done that, let's talk about some other stuff that's important. And this is a little bit harder to quantify, but one important thing are PCIe lanes. So we've seen a shift for like even a couple of years ago, most SSDs or hard drives would be connected to SATA. And SATA had a maximum throughput of 600 megabytes. So once NVMe drives, once like SSDs got faster, like you could make your SSD faster, but it would still be limited by the bandwidth of the SATA port. So then what they started doing is they introduced like PCIe NVMe drive. So they go on your motherboard, or you can buy a card. Like I have one card over here. 1 second. They have like this card. This is like a Gen 4 PCIe card, and you can fit 4 things in there. This is like one of those things. So what they're doing now is they're using the PCI Express lanes for storage as well. So what PCI Express essentially what it used to mostly was for your graphics card. There's also other utility cards like 10 gig Ethernet cards also go in your PCI Express thing. And the bandwidth of PCI Express is a lot higher. This is where your graphics card goes in. So that's why they started adding hard drives to the bandwidth of the PCI Express thing. And the last couple of years, the amount of lanes has increased. So let me just explain a little bit what PCI Express lanes are. And this is a little bit tricky, I guess, to understand. We're going to try to sort of... so there's multiple generations of PCI Express, and every generation kind of doubles the bandwidth. So you have PCI Express 1, PCI Express 2, 3, and 4. Like we're on 4 now. And like if you had a... Like if you have, for example... So PCI Express 4 by 8 slot is as fast as a PCI Express 16 on PCI Express 3 16 slot. So that it kind of doubles the bandwidth. So anyway, you have these lanes, and the motherboard that you pick has and also the CPU that also applies the way it plays into your CPU that you have has a maximum amount of lanes that it can address. If you have a NVMe drive, like a Gen 4 NVMe drive, it might, for example, use up 4 lanes. So if you have like the lower end AMD chips, they don't have a lot of lanes. Like they might have enough lanes to have like 2 NVMe drives and then 1 GPU, something like that. If you go on the higher end, you're gonna have like a lot of lanes, like 46 PCIe lanes, which allows you to like have a whole bunch of graphics cards and then also have a whole bunch of NVMe drives at full speed. Because if you go, like if you're going above the lanes, it means they will sort of get downgraded. So then your 4-speed NVMe might run at like 2-speed, and that will mean it will get slower. There's another thing here that's also important, because this is something I think gets overlooked a little bit. There's more to just the lanes, because on when you still had PCIe 4, the limited lanes on, for example, Ryzen, just the regular Ryzen, you have like pretty limited lanes. So you had like 16 lanes there, which was pretty limited for the amount of NVMe drives that you wanted to put on there. But now we are in Gen 4. And like I mentioned, essentially the bandwidth of like if you have 16 lanes is essentially 32 lanes on Gen 3. So in that case, it might not matter too much if like your NVMe or your graphics card runs at a slower lane. If that kind of makes sense. The throughput is still high enough. You can sort of think of this like a highway or something like that. So you have this highway, and then with like the amount of trucks that can go over the highway on a if you have a Gen 4 at 2-speed or a Gen 3 at 4-speed is the same. The same amount of trucks can go through the lane. So I kind of hope that makes sense. So realistically, like I think I could be. I think Gen 4 NVMe's are now topping out at 7,000 megabytes a second. That I think is not capping the PCI Express 4 limit yet. I'm gonna Google this one real quick. So over here, you can see, like for example, now like if you have the bandwidth 2 gigabytes a second for an X1. Well, if you have a Gen 4 at 7 gigabytes, that's about maxing out, I guess, than the 4 lanes. But again, that's also where these cards come in. This is an X16 card. You can stack a lot because this is an X16 card, so each thing over here would run at 4. So anyway, let's go back to the thing. So anyway, here's your cheat sheet. So anyway, you can kind of just have a look at something like that and see sort of what you want to do. Like how many NVMe drives do you want? Like, do you want something like this or whatever, and you can do a little quick calculation on the speed that you kind of want to get out of it. So that is that is quite important. Other things on your motherboard might be important that to some, like for example, I have a 10 gigabyte switch and I want a motherboard that has 10 gigabyte Ethernet. More and more motherboards are getting 10 gigabit Ethernet. If you don't know what 10 gigabit, so normal Ethernet with your cable caps out at about 125 megabytes a second. 10 gig caps about like 1125, I think. So it's 10 times faster. If you're not going to use that, then 10 gig doesn't really matter. Another thing that you kind of need to sort of keep in mind is the spacing on your graphics cards. So, cards space. I'm just Googling stuff in the meantime, and I'm gonna close my Steam because I keep getting annoying pop-ups from a guy that keeps opening programs. All right, let me just show my screen again. Oh, all right, so you can see here. So most graphics cards are 2 or 3 slots. So most 3090s, for example, are right now are 3 slots. And you can see here it's labeled. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you have a 3 slot GPU, it will sort of sit in this thing, and then it will also go over this thing. So then you only have 1 slot left here. So this slot cannot be used if you use a specific cooler. So in my case, I have a I forgot the name for my Gigabyte X399 Threadripper Extreme. Right, you know what? I'm just gonna go to my own website. I have a build log for all my old videos. Oh wait, it's under this. Go check out my website, guys. timothy.com. But yeah, here's the hardware. So if you look at my motherboard, for example, just click on it. So here, you can see here's space for 4 2-slot cards. So keep that in mind, and that kind of plays into the graphics card section before. Keep in mind the spacing that you want to use. So if you want to build a machine that can do a lot of like GPU rendering, and you want to be able to have more cards. So let's say I want to have two graphics cards, and then maybe one of these. Then I could put one here. So I have a lot of space. But like even a lot of the higher end models are sort of more built to fit 3-slot cards. So if you look at this, so this is my motherboard, and here you could have like 1 2-slot, or another 2-slot, or another 2-slot, or you could have like a 1 2-slot, 1 2-slot, then have like one of these in between, or like 2 of those, and do like a raid between the 2, and like go absolutely crazy. Anyway, so that's kind of something that you could do. On here in the back, I/O again, 2 10 gigabyte. Here's USB-C. That might be something that you might be interested in. I have a USB-C hub, which might be interesting for some people, something like that. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Another thing, which is getting a little bit more technical, but you have these chips here, which are the VRMs. They modulate the voltage, and essentially, what it is, if you're gonna have a system that's gonna be under like 24/7 load, more and better VRMs are sort of just are gonna perform better, get less hot, and if you have a prolonged usage. So that's something to keep in mind with reviews as well. Like keep in mind that the cheaper motherboards will maybe not be the best if you're gonna plan to use this 24/7. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Other things, my motherboard, for example, here you can see has switches down here in the bottom. Those are BIOS switches. So some of the more expensive motherboards might have 2 BIOSes. So you can have if you're gonna maybe play with some overclocking settings in your BIOS, which I probably wouldn't do if you're having a workstation build. You probably want to run it as stable as possible. But if you want to play with them, it's useful to be able to have two. Other things that might be useful to look into when your motherboard is like support for different types of RAID. Are you planning to use RAID? How many NVMe slots are on your motherboard? For example, on my motherboard, there's 4 NVMe slots. So I can have 4 NVMe drives already on my motherboard, which is super useful. So let's say if you want to, and we're going to talk about this NVMe stuff a little bit after this. So if you want a lot of these NVMe slots, again, you need the lanes, which is like on your CPU and your motherboard. That's something you need. But also you need the physical slots there to be able to, to put them in. Other things that are useful to just keep in mind are like you have, this thing has like a readout for error code. So if you're building it yourself, something like that might be useful. And yeah, just like in general, that's kind of, I think, the overarching idea between picking a motherboard. There's more because this stuff has like the technical, like stuff between computers. There's so much you could talk about, but I think this kind of sums it up. If you're gonna build again, workstation, I'd say look for something that can at least like hold maybe like 2 NVMe drives, because that might be useful. Like you might have one for your operating system, one for like working and caches. Again, you could also always add one of these. But again, that's just something to sort of maybe keep in mind. So even if you're on the lower end, might be nice to have. And again, make sure to match your CPU and your motherboard, all of that stuff. Pretty simple, but yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, I guess we can move on from the motherboard to the next thing. Let's talk a little about these NVMe drives that we're already talking about, or just hard drives in general. Probably, for the most part, it's affordable enough now to be able to go all NVMe. They're still somewhat on the pricey side, but it's getting cheaper, and it's really nice to have a really nice fast drive. So again, that kind of plays in, like, and then when so I'm also going to talk about hard drives and regular SSDs, by the way. But if you're gonna be buying an NVMe drive, important is to check what platform are you on. Is it a Gen 4 or a Gen 3 platform with the PCI Express thing that I was explaining earlier? So I think Intel was still on PCI Express 3, although I think with their latest release, they might have gone to 4. So does it make sense to buy a Gen 4 NVMe if you have a Gen 3 motherboard? So that's kind of a thing. And then you can just look at benchmarks. So like, what are the sequential reads? What are the sequential writes? Another important thing when you're buying SSDs is you have the wait, let me just look for the correct naming for all of these. So you have different, what they're doing. Okay, let me just try to explain this the best way. If you're having a SSD, they would just store 1 bit per cell or something like that. Then they discovered, all right, we can store multiple things in one cell. And they sort of try to just like keep increasing that. And now they're on, if you have the QLV cards, I think, let me just grab one. All right, so I've looked up a better site. So there's a Synology site here. So TLC here. So there's like the low end consumer is QLC. There's a quad level cell, and then you have mainstream and data center. Essentially, that's important to pay attention to because it kind of matters, like how many writes am I gonna do to my drive. So if you have a drive that you know is gonna have a lot of reading and writing done from it, let's say a cache drive or a drive that you work from, QLC is probably not the best drive because it will probably fill really fast. Because it just, like, it can handle less reads and writes. So something in between there is probably a good one. I wouldn't go like the Pro one unless you're going like really high budget and you might get the Pro one. But like something like in between is probably good. But the QLC one might be fine to like run some programs from, stuff like that. or just bulk storage that you don't necessarily use that much. But again, then you could probably just use a regular hard drive, regular old SATA hard drive. So yeah, this is just like something to consider. So again, like I'd say the Pro drives are not necessarily, well, it depends on your budget. A little bit different to give an exact thing, but like I wouldn't go QLC. Also, the performance on QLC drives is not the best. I'd say just the ones in between is probably decent enough for most people. And like if you're building something, like is your work drive to have like just like have your work drive on an NVMe is really nice. I have one work drive which is a RAID pool, which is RAID NVMe. I should probably explain what that is. And I have another NVMe, just has my operating system. So something like that, a split like that might make a lot of sense. You can also just buy one bigger one and do everything from that, depending on your budget or how many slots you have on your motherboard. So that might be something. Also with the, like I mentioned, the RAID thing. So what RAID is, okay, we're throwing a lot of technical terms here, but like I mentioned, this is just me rambling. That's also why I didn't want to do any graphics over top. This is going to be just me talking with my soothing voice and my fancy mic. So anyway, what RAID is let's say you have 2 drives, and instead and what you can do is you can say, all right, I have this one file here. It's like a 1 megabyte file. Instead of storing it on one of the 2 drives, or you can say, for example, if you're RAID 1, the data will live on both the drives. So both this one and the other one. So if then one of the drive fails, then you still have the data on your other drive. What you can also do is RAID 0. In RAID 0, if you have the 1 megabyte file, it will essentially go from, it will store 500 megabyte or 500 kilobytes on one drive and then 500 kilobytes on the other drive. So then if you read the file, it's going to read it from 2 drives. So it's going to be twice as fast. But also, if one of your drives fails, you lose all of your data. So you lose on redundancy. If you want to see my workflow for this, I have a video where I'm talking about my workflow with my NVMe RAID and how I'm mirroring my NVMe drive to my NAS, my storage server. So I have both redundancy from my NAS and the speed from my NVMe. So that might be something that you can also consider doing. But yeah, I mean, so that is something to consider when you're doing. So anyway, when we're talking about these NVMe's, if you're on the lower end, probably just get like a, I would say, okay, for programs, an NVMe doesn't necessarily matter too much. Like it loads a little bit faster, but you can probably get away with just getting a regular SATA SSD for like your Windows or your programs or whatever, and then keep your NVMe for like your projects and stuff that you want like to be really fast, like a cache drive. You can alternatively also have a bulk storage device, like to store big files on. Also, always make backups, by the way, of your stuff, and preferably you want to do bulk storage on like something like a separate device, like a NAS drive, or like back them up in like Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever. But for general working drives, I'd say like an NVMe thing, and also something to consider with the NVMe, because I get like 9 gigabytes a second sequential read with my RAID NVMe in RAID 0. And you might think, well, everything is going to be super fast, real-time scrubbing, blah, blah, blah. There's other overhead to consider, so it's not necessarily the case. It's not going to be like, you might think 9 gigabytes a second. Okay, if I have a sequence of EXR files, let's say, that are like 200 megabytes frame that you can scrub real-time. It's because it needs to do some uncompression, things like that. That's the case also in Houdini. Like if I open a heavy scene that has to load like whatever, like 5 gigabytes of data, it's not going to be instantly there, even though theoretically you would think that with that sequential read, it should be able to do that. It still takes a couple of seconds to load it in. It's definitely faster than a hard drive, but don't expect the best of the best performance. That's also why I would say it probably makes more sense. Like if you're going to RAID, and you want like a 4 gigabyte pool, you might have the consideration of like, okay, I'm going to do 4 1 terabyte drives and I'm going to have harder sequential reads. Also, 4 times higher drive failure potential. Or you could get 2 terabyte. I would probably say go for the 2 terabyte because the extra speed you're going to get from like above that, like the above whatever it is, you're not going to notice it. Like there's other overheads to consider. Like we've gotten to the point where storage is faster than the other hardware, which is pretty crazy. Because it used to be the other way around, which is regular hard drives and SATA hard drives, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that's storage. That's storage for you. Again, like if you want to have redundancy to like backups, you can, if you're on Windows or whatever, like you put two hard drives in Windows storage spaces, use it as a bulk drive storage thing. In Linux, you can also just do regular RAID. This might be good for bulk storage if you want redundancy. If you're not gonna do redundancy, might be good to consider. If you're gonna run Windows, run something like Backblaze, allows you unlimited backup of your files. Definitely like just archive stuff with like really have a backup. It's very important. You don't want to lose files. I'm proud to say that I have almost all of my files since I was 13, starting with animation. I still have my first projects. I've never lost anything apart from when I was still studying. I had both my main drive and my backup drive fail in the same week, and that is after that I've really become really anal about like backing up everything because I don't want to lose anything. So anyway, that's something to consider. So let's move along. We've talked for a way too long time already. So let's talk about some other things. So another thing, less sexy, but let's talk about power supply. Not that much to say, but you have first off, you're gonna need to calculate how much does my computer use. So you can Google PSU calculator. I'm just gonna do that real quick and share my screen. All right. So this is a good starting point. So let's say you do a Ryzen 5950X. One of them, let's say 90% utilization, might be pretty good. Let's say you do 2 sticks of 16 gigabytes. So it's like would be the 32 gigs of RAM. Let's say you do 1 RTX. Or let's do a budget build thing. Let's do the 3090 thing. Then this is probably too high CPU. Anyway, let's just go for this. Storage, let's say with 2 NVMe's. Let's not do this. Let's keep it easy. But you can let's do 3 fans, 20, and let's say whatever, 1 liquid cooling kit. Utilization, let's say 24/7. Let's say you want to render a lot of times. And then you can say calculate, and it's going to give you a recommended PSU. So this one, you would recommended PSU would be 1650 watt. You would not top it out. But so something like this is generally pretty good to have a look at something like that. See kind of roughly what you need for your PSU. It's good to be on the higher side because even if you're not capping out, it's going to be more like it's going to it's not the best to run your PSU at near to maximum load, because if your PSU fails, it might give you a shortage and it might wreck your other components. Never skim out on a PSU. Buy a good PSU. Don't buy a cheap PSU. Important stuff here. Don't say I told you so. Like really buy a good PSU. It's like but like generally buy like a little bit on the higher side. Pretty important. PSUs have ratings, so you have like bronze, silver, gold, platinum. That doesn't necessarily matter too much for most people. You could probably, if you're doing like a budget lower end thing, you could probably get away with like a bronze. If you're gonna run a machine that's gonna run 24/7 and has a lot of like graphics cards in there, for example, the higher rated ones are more efficient. So essentially the efficiency is like how much of the electricity is actually utilized and how much just gets wasted in like heat. So if you're gonna run like a 4 GPU build or something like that, it might make sense to get like a platinum rated one, because efficiency there is going to really come into place. It's going to be when we're going to get on the higher end. Generally, in terms of brands, like I really like Be Quiet. Corsair is pretty good as well. But again, like do the calculator, see what comes up, and like get something there. It's not rocket science, but don't get Seasonic, also great PSUs. But like when you're on the high end, it might make sense to also go for efficiency. On the lower end, I wouldn't like. I'd say it's maybe not necessarily worth it to invest in to especially get like the gold rated one. Like the money in that case might be better spent to like a little bit more RAM, better graphics card, something like that. So yeah, we're almost through everything, guys. This video has honestly gone on way longer than I thought. I thought it would be done like 20 minutes. I don't know how long I've been talking. It's got to be like over an hour, probably. All right, I was just ramble too much. Anyway, hopefully you still like it. If you do like it, leave us a thumbs up. Yeah, thanks. Woo, peace. Yeah, whatever. All right, let's talk a little bit about the case. So, a case is kind of about aesthetics. Do you like it? I personally don't care too much for aesthetics of my PC. I have it under my desk here. I've like I know some people really care about the aesthetically pleasing room. I don't really have that too much. Like, I mean, I have my sort of nice little recording background here with my retro consoles. I have like these, but like I don't really care too much. I do have a pretty nice looking case, to be honest. Like I have O11 Dynamics XL, but the reason why I got that, O11 Dynamic XL. Let me just show you the pictures. I have, by the way, a build log of my entire PC. Right, but so the O11 Dynamic XL, it's in this case over here. I have the black one. So this one. There's LED everywhere. But the reason why I got that one is because at first I wanted the water cooling, and this is like pretty good water cooling case. So that's something to consider if you want to do water cooling. Second thing to consider, this case has room for 2 power supplies. And my thought was that, okay, if I ever want to run like 4 3090s at some point or something like that, then it might be a good idea to add a second power supply. That's only going to be a consideration if you're on the really high end. For most others, just look at some reviews. OLED, like Lee and Lee makes pretty good cases. Corsair makes pretty good cases. If you want a more quiet air cooling build, oh Jesus Christ, what I'm blacking out for my Fractal Design. Fractal Design makes really nice cases. So Fractal Design define R5. I have an R5 and an R6, I think. So I have 2 of those. So Fractal Design. Oh, they already have R6. There we go. I think it's a really nice, clean looking case. It's pretty quiet. Like it's not so for like a mid-range build. Like if you're not gonna crank, like you can. This is something to, by the way, to consider. Also, when you want to do a GPU build, have a look at how much space do I have for graphics card, because this one, 1, 2, 3 can only fit 3 dual slot cards. So if you're gonna do a multi-build, like a multi-card GPU, again, something like this would probably not be the best. So yeah, that's something to consider. I'll put I'll put links to what I have in my PC in the description. I'll put some recommendation list, I guess, in the description as well, for maybe like multiple different builds for whatever, something like that. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to put in the description, but something along those lines. But yeah, that's essentially like the case. One more thing, by the way, that we talked about the case. Yeah, like just buy something that you like and that cools reasonably well. So what is it called? There's one really good case review channel. I'm really blacking out here with the name. Oh, Gamers Nexus. Gamers Nexus does the best case reviews by far. They really test everything, like all of the temperatures and everything. So check out Gamers Nexus on YouTube. I guess I'll put a link to them. If I don't forget, I'll put a link to their channel in the description. They do absolutely phenomenal case reviews. Really, really, really in depth. So highly recommend checking that out. So some other stuff that you might want to keep in mind is like, let's say we want to do some cooling, because we need to cool our CPU, right? So if we're going to talk about the... so there's essentially, there's 3 options when you're going to go CPU, if you're going to cool your CPU. We have air cooling, we have all-in-one water cooling, and we have custom loop water cooling. So air cooling is, I would probably recommend for a mid-range build, even for maybe some high-range build, but for a mid-range build, go air cooling. On the Threadripper side, it's getting a little bit difficult with air coolers because they just output too much heat. But for mid-range, go air cooling because I know you might be inclined to go with all-in-one water cooling. The thing is, with all-in-one water cooling, and I've personally had this happen with an all-in-one water cooling, the pump can fail. So because it has more moving parts, and if the pump fails, well, you're pretty much screwed, and you need to get your cooler serviced or need to get a new cooler. When that happened to me, I just bought an air cooler for that specific system. Air coolers, like they really can't fail. Like the fan might fail, and then you might get a temperature warning, and you just notice, oh, my fan is not spinning, and you put in another fan. Those fans are like maybe $10, so it's like pretty cheap. So for any mid-range, just Ryzen build or mid-range Intel build, just get air cooling. I mean, it's good enough. For the all-in-one, once you get to the multi-core, like the Threadripper type stuff, then you kind of forced to either go custom loop water cooling or go all-in-one water cooling. Like just watch some reviews. Like the Corsair, I had an H115 before. This is the one that failed. In general, I think they're pretty decent. The problem is also with all-in-one water coolers that you cannot take out the liquid and put it back in. Like if you have a custom loop water cooling, like I have in my desktop, you can like every year or something, you can take out the liquid, put in new liquid, because like some gunk might form or like and it might clog up. And that's what I guess what happened to my previous. You can hear some of my old tutorials, like you hear the really loud CPU, and I think I even made some jokes about my CPU is blazing like 420. That's just before the pump started failing, because it's like little tiny debris will get in and will just fail. So in that range, I think all-in-one water cooling is pretty good. Custom loop. I have one video where I did my custom loop, where in my custom loop video, I said I was going to custom loop water cool my GPUs, which I haven't done yet. I'm still planning to, but my current 3090s I have, my dual Asus turbos, don't have a water block yet. Big C is making water blocks for them. So once those are out, I am planning to do water cooling on those. So I'm going to get 2 blocks for them. I'm really hoping at some point, and then I'm probably going to do a video about that. So that's kind of why that never happened. But custom loop water cooling it's really expensive to go custom loop. Like if you're gonna do a CPU only custom loop, you're thinking about it's gonna be $500-600 for just the CPU loop. And then if you're gonna add GPUs, I'd say add like 400 on top for each GPU that you're gonna add. So if you're gonna add a bunch of GPUs, like you're really looking at like 1,200, 1,500 euros, dollars, whatever it is, for cooling, which is for most people, unless you really like water cooling, and then that's also fine. Like you just do it because you like it. It's like I don't judge. I thought it was pretty fun to build my first water cooling loop. Again, there's a video for the description. But there was like, that's fun. That's a hobby in itself. But unless you're building a multi GPU system, which I was kind of planning to add the GPUs in there, that's why I went with custom loop. It's probably not worth it. Just the all-in-one is probably, unless you're worried about like being able to replace stuff. In that case, then custom loop might be worth it. In that case, if you're really worried about redundancy, you could even go for a dual loop or dual pump, like a dual pump build or something. Or you could do like dual loop. There's people like adding like custom loop for like their GPU specifically. But anyway, that's kind of the things that you could do with your GPU. I know like we've gone to the point where it's not specific to VFX anymore, but it's still interesting to talk about this. I get it's really become just a podcast of me rambling. I should do this more often. It's kind of fun actually, just ramble into the mic. So yeah, essentially we've I think talked about every component. Let me think. Have we missed anything? Well, I mean, there's monitors. We could just throw monitors in there, YOLO, right? So I don't want to spend too much time on the monitor aspect of it, because that would require essentially just a video in itself, because it's really broad subject. It really depends what you're doing. For most people, generally, like, okay, in terms of resolution, if you're getting a 4K screen, I would probably get 30 inches and above, because else you need to use UI scaling. I have a 32 inch, even I still use UI scaling. And then you're kind of negating the benefit of having the extra pixels. But this is nice to have like a big screen. So that is one thing to keep in consideration. Another thing is the color reproduction. I am not an expert on this, but so you really just look up reviews for this. But there's different color spaces. You have sRGB, Adobe RGB, DCI-P3. These are and like a whole bunch of color spaces. And essentially, monitors cover a different spectrum of the amount of colors. And essentially, that just means how many colors can my monitor show. If you're going to be a color grader, then you need a very high-end monitor that can really show all of the colors and is super accurately calibrated. In that case, you also need to buy like a X-Rite or Spyro to really calibrate your monitor. Then you're looking at monitors that are going to be like 10,000 a pop, like really like the ISO things, like the really expensive ones. Slightly below that, you have pretty decent, just regular ones. BenQ has pretty good production monitors with like pretty decent color reproduction. Those are pretty decent. And the always important to keep in mind is that you probably want an IPS screen. In plane switching, just viewing angles are better, because with TN panels, which are more gamer oriented, they have lower latency, but like the colors will switch at like different angles. So you probably don't want to do that. And if you're gonna get a monitor that you both want to use for gaming and for work, then you're gonna have a little bit of a problem, because if you want like a high refresh rate monitor, generally high refresh rate monitors come at the cost of color accuracy. So just keep in mind for yourself what is important. For me personally, like, I'd like to say that, I really want the best color reproduction, for it's so important for the work I do. But realistically, as long as it like covers like my monitor it covers 100% of sRGB. It's quite an older monitor, and it's not an HDR monitor right now, and it is just fine for me now. I am planning to upgrade my monitor setup here within probably 2 years. I really want to wait for OLED monitors to become a thing. I really want to upgrade to like a very big OLED screen, because those are just going out and extremely expensive right now. I want a very nice high refresh rate OLED with good color reproduction. I'm kind of hoping that will come out at some point. But that's something to consider. Look at the panel bit depth. If you're for color accuracy, get like a 12-bit or 14-bit panel. Again, those will be more color accurate. Then look at reviews on like what parts of the color spectrum they cover. If you're gonna get a mix of like game and work monitor, you're not gonna find like the most color accurate monitors. And again, like the more production built monitors, like the, for example, BenQ has really nice monitors for creative professional. Like I have a BenQ monitor which is aimed at professionals, but I bought mine in 2016 when it was then 4K just started becoming really a thing on monitor, so I got one back then. But it's not an HDR screen, but like it has a whole bunch of options for that you would like for color calibrations and multiple profiles, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, I guess we're talking about anyway, to keep in mind, like if you want a keyboard, I like mechanical keyboards. This is a mechanical keyboard. Whoa. All right, do you see that stuff that's going on with the lights? that is not what it looks like when I look at it like this. So the frequency of the light is not in sync with my camera. So anyway, mechanical keyboards are nice if you type a lot, because they have, if you want to know what mechanical keyboards have an actual activation. It's very nice if you type a lot. There's multiple switches. I have blue switches. They make a lot of sound. I'm not going to get into all of that. Mice, get a good mouse. I've had my previous mouse, which I bought like when I was young, and it was like I got a really high-end mouse. It lasted me 9 years. It's still working, but I just upgraded because I needed, like, it was some stuff was like a little bit weird. So I got another good mouse. I like wired mouses, so there's a wire. Get a Wacom tablet. Get a Intuos Pro. This isn't a really old one. I've had this for 10 years or something. It still works. I've had to replace the thing at some point. If you're going to do any sculpting, texture painting, whatever. I don't use it in Houdini, but like use this stuff when you're doing like Photoshop, After Effects, whatever. I use that all the time. Get the Pro one. The regular Intuos are not accurate. It's really hard to get straight lines out of them. At least that was when I last used a regular Intuos at some point. It was a couple of years ago. They were pretty bad back then. So get the Pro one. They're really expensive. Well, relatively expensive, but it's, if you're gonna get a tablet, get the Pro one. It's well worth getting the Pro one. Yeah, right. I think that's everything. So this has gone on way too long. I'm getting hungry. It's like it's at night now. You've probably seen the color temperature change a little bit. But yeah, hopefully this was sort of interesting take on what hardware you should buy for your or just in general, but like for your VFX workflows. So hopefully this was informative. If you did like it, leave this a thumbs up. Really, again, like I keep saying, but it really helps out the channel. If you didn't like, leave it a thumbs down. Still helps out the channel because it helps with because if people interact with your video, it helps out. So if you really hate it, then you shouldn't press any button. But then still, like, I prefer you press the thumbs up. Anyway, if you want to see more videos like this, I do a lot of tutorials. I do videos like this where I'm just rumbling randomly about stuff that interests me, like hardware, all the time. So yeah, subscribe and you can see more of these videos. And I have Patreon as well, so if you want to support the channel over there, like all of the awesome people that are going to come after the credits, then you can do that over there, and it really helps out the channel. Like, I've been able to put more time into YouTube and creating courses ever since I started doing Patreon and Gumroad, because like it does generate some income, and I can do a little bit less client work in order to focus on this type of stuff. So that's really helps out. So if you want to help out there, thanks a bunch, and hopefully I'll see you in another video. See you next time, guys. Peace.